9:16, Tennessee lawmakers have just wrapped up a special session in Nashville. They passed legislation that would significantly stiffen penalties against protesters on state property and also address some COVID-19 liability issues and telemedicine. Republican Senator Brian Kelsey from Germantown joins us live this morning. Thank you, Brian, always for your time. Let's start with the so-called protester bill. The special session is estimated to have cost almost $120,000. And what would you say to constituents who would say we're in a situation where the legislature has already had a shortened session? We're facing a situation where more than 1,000 Tennesseans have died in the pandemic. Many, many more are unemployed and facing financial constraints. What would you say to constituents who ask about the merits of this special session that costs them additional money?
Well, the reason of this pandemic is exactly why we had to have this special session, and I'm very glad that we took the time to do our duty and to go ahead and do the things necessary to restart our economy. So what we did was we passed legislation that will protect businesses against frivolous lawsuits, and so that they can reopen their doors and they can restart our economy with confidence. And then most importantly of all, they can now rehire some of their workers that had to be laid off. And that, I think, will be a big help, and that was definitely worth having the special session over.
Specifically on the protester bill, however, in a country that was built on protest, as I understand it, it's now a felony for any protester to camp out on state property, which I would remind you is paid for by their tax dollars. How do you explain that, particularly given the fact that we're facing a pandemic? Is that really the most important use of the legislature's time?
No, I don't think that is, and that's why I particularly voted against this, and the Senate was against that provision. The House added it back into the bill. But I do think it's important to remember what Tennessee has done to address many of the concerns of protesters over the years. After that Darius Stewart tragic death back in 2015, I'm very proud of the work that we did when I was leading the Senate Judiciary Committee to have the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation now investigate all officer-involved shootings. It's a big change that many other states don't do. And then another thing that we did was working with Representative John DeBerry, we passed a bill that required every law enforcement agency in the entire state to develop a policy against racial profiling. So we have taken steps to address some of these concerns. I know our Governor Lee is committed to doing criminal justice reform in the future. And so now I would ask those protesters to join with us in that effort, because there's much work left to be done for sure.
Let's talk about the liability bill. It gives protections to businesses, churches, schools if someone gets sick. Critics of it, however, say that if a company does not provide protections for its employees, this is really not an appropriate bill for employees as they head back to work, perhaps a little fearful. What protections? There's already been some criticism of TOSHA, the Tennessee version of the Occupational Health and Safety Administration, not dealing with companies that aren't providing protections. Does this bill weaken protections for employees specifically who have to go back to work if their company's not doing anything to protect them?
Well, I think this bill drew exactly the line that we need in this state, and that is, it said that if a company is acting very badly, in other words, if they're committing gross negligence is the legal term, or intentionally bad behavior, then in those cases there's no protection for that company. But if the company is simply doing what it normally does and doing its best to operate in what admittedly is for all of us a very, very difficult environment, then in those cases they shouldn't have to worry about being sued. And that's what this bill protects.
How does the bill specifically set aside the companies that are acting badly?
Well, it sets up this legal standard, and there have been 200 years worth of cases that have tried to define what that means. But the courts generally know what it means when we talk about gross negligence and willful conduct and intentional conduct of that nature. So basically, if it's a really bad act, then in that case the protection doesn't apply. But if it's what we call simple negligence, in other words, you're doing your best, you're going about your day, but you're dealing with what we all recognize is this is an international pandemic.
Right.
It affects us all. People are getting sick every day. Unfortunately, they're dying every day.
Well, it's definitely uncharted territory for all.
And the reality is we don't know where we're catching it.
Have you
so
heard?
To file a lawsuit just saying, "Oh, hey, I think I caught it over here," that's not fair to just shake down a business to try to get $20,000 out of them.
Have you heard concerns about TOSHA not following up with companies appropriately? And do you share those concerns? Have you done anything to look into those concerns?
I particularly in my office have not gotten a lot of communication about TOSHA. I mean, I will say that that it's really the federal government, the OSHA, that is well funded in that area to be able to take a leadership role in those issues. But I'm happy to look into those concerns as well.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time this morning.
Thanks for having me on, Mary Beth.
All right. Be safe.